Hello and welcome to Anti-Doping Updates. My name is Mike Cook and I am going to bring you the show to talk to you about the most recent anti-doping updates that are available in the world for sport. If you are interested in anti-doping and clean sport, then this is the show for you. A little bit about my background. I have a law degree from Lewis and Clark Northwestern School of Law. I work in the area of administrative law in the state of Oregon. As an athlete, I was competing in gymnastics in NCAA competitions, and since my college career, I've competed in weightlifting, in functional fitness, in CrossFit, and triathlon. And I have developed an expertise in anti-doping issues, and I'm happy to share my expertise with you. So on today's show, we have three interesting stories to talk about. First up, Coleman. Second, Shayna Jack. And third, Andrea Ianonne. Okay, let's get started on the first story, Coleman. Coleman is an American 100-meter sprinter, and he was ranked #1 in the world in 2019 after winning the 100 meters at the 2019 World Championships. He was one of the favorites to win the Olympics in 2020. As an athlete in the registered testing pool, athletes must update their whereabouts findings once every quarter. And as part of those whereabouts findings, athletes are required to indicate a 60-minute period in which they can be reached at for testing, 60 minutes each day. So the Athletics Integrity Unit found that he had failed to meet his whereabouts requirements. If you have three missed whereabouts requirements in a 12-month period, then that constitutes an anti-doping violation, and the usual consequence for that is a 2-year suspension. So that's what's at issue for Mr. Coleman. He requested a hearing with the Athletics Integrity Unit, which is the unit that makes the decisions on behalf of World Athletics, and he contested 2 out of those 3 filings. The first one was regard to a whereabouts filings on April 26. He indicated in his whereabouts findings that he would be at his home in Lexington, Kentucky. When the doping control officer tried to contact him, Coleman was actually at the Drake Relays in Iowa, competing there. Shortly after the doping control officer contacted him by telephone, he switched around his whereabouts and updated it retroactively to indicate that he was at the Drake Relays in Iowa. At his hearing with the Athletics Integrity Unit, he argued that since he had updated his filing before the end of the 60-minute period, then that shouldn't count as a missed test. The Athletics Integrity Unit didn't agree with him. They found that you're supposed to update your filings as soon as you're aware of any changes, and Mr. Coleman didn't do that. He didn't update his filings until after the fact. So that was another of his missed tests. The last one occurred on December 9th. Mr. Coleman indicated in his whereabouts findings that he would be at his home in Lexington, Kentucky, and his 60-minute period that he would be available for testing was 7:15 to 8:15 p.m. The doping control officer showed up at his home. The doping control officer and the blood collection agent were there. They took pictures of his front door at 8:21 and indicated that the lights were off and he wasn't home at that time. In his hearing, Coleman argued that he was home, that he went out to get Chipotle at 7:15, went back home, watched the kickoff of the Monday Night Football game, then left home to go shopping at Walmart and purchase 16 items, and then came back, and the doping control officers must have either left early or missed them. And he had receipts from Chipotle and from Walmart that were time-stamped. The Athletic Integrity Unit didn't buy that defense either. They found that it's more plausible that the doping control officers were at Coleman's home, since they had the time-stamped photograph of when they were there, and Mr. Coleman wasn't at his home at all. So I mentioned that the usual sanction for 3 whereabouts filings in a 12-month period is 2 years. That can be reduced depending upon the degree of fault of the individual. And the Athlete Integrity Unit found that Mr. Coleman didn't deserve any sort of reduction in sanction. In fact, they found that he was reckless or in disregard of the requirements and sanctioned him for the 2 years. His sanction will end in 2022. So as of now, Christian Coleman, who was one of the favorites for the 100-meter dash in the Olympics, is out of the Olympics. Won't be eligible to participate because he'll be under the 2-year ban. Mr. Coleman does have the chance to appeal for the Court for Arbitration of Sport. We'll see if he does that and what they decide. That should be another story for a subsequent anti-doping update. The next story to talk about is Shayna Jack. Shayna Jack is an Australian swimmer who tested positive for ligandrol in an out-of-competition test in June of 2019. Ligandrol is a non-steroidal oral selective androgen receptor modulator, or SARM. It's known also as LGD4033 or VK5211. It increases the repair and growth of muscles. So that's what she tested positive for in an out-of-competition test. Because so the Australian Anti-Doping Association referred her case to the Court for Arbitration of Sport for a first instance hearing on the matter. Usually, National Anti-Doping Association does their own hearings in-house, but in this case, the Australian Anti-Doping Authority delegated that authority to do first instance hearings to the Court for Arbitration of Sport, who assigned it to a single arbitrator. The Australian Anti-Doping Association sent Shayna Jack a notice of disqualification of 4 years. Shayna Jack appealed that decision, and the Australian Anti-Doping Authority delegated its hearing responsibilities to the Court for Arbitration of Sport, who held the first instance hearing with the sole arbitrator. The sole arbitrator decided that Shayna Jack had met her burden of proof to show that the positive test for ligandrol was unintentional and gave a reduced sanction of 2 years. The Court for Arbitration of Sport just published the press release on that, and so we don't know exactly how Shayna Jack had shown that the positive test for ligandrol was unintentional. So hopefully we'll get the full decision from the Court for Arbitration of Sport soon. The last story is Andrea Ianonne. Andrea Ianonne is a professional motorcycle racer who races in MotoGP. He was tested at the 2019 World Championships in Malaysia, and both his A and B sample tested positive for dostranolone. And dostranolone is a banned substance known by the trade name Masteron, and it is an androgen and anabolic steroid that's used to improve physique by injecting it directly into the muscle. Ianonne submitted a statement of defense to the International Motorcycle Federation and argued that his positive test for dostranolone was due to tainted meat or contaminated meat. The International Motorcycle Federation accepted that finding and found that his positive sample was unintentional, and therefore they sanctioned him for 18 months. Now this is where the case gets really interesting. After that decision, Andrea Ianonne appealed to the Court for Arbitration of Sport, arguing for a reduced sanction, something less than 18 months. And the World Anti-Doping Association also appealed that decision, which they have the right to do, and argued for a greater sanction. So that brings us to the Court for Arbitration of Sport. And the Court for Arbitration of Sport took a much different view of the case than the International Motorcycle Federation. the Court for Arbitration of Sport argued that in order to be successful with a tainted meat defense, the individual must present some evidence, some concrete evidence about what they actually ate, and some concrete scientific evidence showing that the amount of that it's plausible that tainted meat could result in the positive test that's at issue. And they found that Mr. Ianonne hadn't even done that, hadn't shown what he ate, whether it was meat or poultry or pork, or that he hadn't shown that there's a problem with contaminated meat in Malaysia, and hadn't shown that his test could have been resulted plausibly from tainted meat. And so, whereas the International Motorcycle Federation found that the positive sample was unintentional, the Court for Arbitration of Sport found that because he hadn't shown otherwise, it's an intentional violation. And this is an in-competition test, and the sanction for an intentional violation for an in-competition test for a banned substance is a 4-year penalty. And so that's what Mr. Ianonne has, is a 4-year penalty for him. And that's it for this Stories for Anti-Doping update. Look back next week for some new cases to talk about. Thanks.